Okay, so this is a tutorial for preparing a digital file for burning into a screen for printing repeat patterns on fabric or wallpaper yardage. And the end result of this would be a digital file that's ready for a positive for a screen setup like this, where a single repeat is burned into the screen and it's ready to use with a rail system like this where you can move the screen like in parallel to the previous color and patterns that you put down. And specifically, I want to talk through how to create a screen print digital file positive that's ready for seamless patterns like this, where you have some layers or colors that blend into the neighbors on the left and the right. And there's two parts of this that I'm going to talk through. One is the creation of what I learned is called a jog line. And by that, I mean the line that separates the first repetition from the second repetition. So when you come to a digital file like this, however you might come to it, and you know that it repeats seamlessly in the left and right direction, you probably will have something like this where the cut is a straight vertical line. And what I want to talk through is how do we make a cut that's a little more artful and forgiving for mistakes? And that might look like this, where it's no longer a straight line, but rather a more organic shape through the pattern. And the second point I'll talk about is how do we add some overlap elements to that cut that give us a little more wiggle room when we make the inevitable mistakes we'll make in the printing process. And what I mean by that, I can show here. So I have this tile, this variation of the pattern I'll be dealing with the elk on it. And the individual tile again looks like this. So this is after the step of creating a more organic jog line. And I will activate this layer to make this tile red for a second, and I will select the next one and press the 5 key to reduce its transparency a little bit. And so in the ideal position, which for all other cases would be like the two tiles lining up again. So, oops. Uh, in this example, the ideal position for these two tiles is like directly next to each other with this like harsh vertical line cutting through them. The ideal position for these two tiles involves some overlap, where this black area in the cloudy bottom and this black area in the grassy top do overlap. And otherwise, the organic line is separating the rocks and the roots in a kind of logical way. What this allows for is a little wiggle room if we misregister when we're printing and we create too much of a gap or too much overlap with each tile that we put down. So I will take the semi-transparent tile and I will just pull it over, and then I will press 0 to bring back its transparency up, and I will toggle the visibility of that red layer. And you can see that in this situation where there's too much gap, I've given myself a little more wiggle room with the grass and the clouds where the gap is a little less obvious, as opposed to over here in this situation where if I select this tile and I move it over, any sort of gap like this is very obvious. Even if it's very small, like less than an eighth of an inch, you're going to notice that break in the pattern a lot more quickly than you will with a gap like this. Now I could still do a little more around this rocky area, maybe in these roots, but this is preferable to what I showed just a second ago. And likewise, if I reactivate and reduce the transparency of this and I create more overlap than I intended, and then I go back. Likewise, this is a more forgivable overlap than what might happen in the case over here, where if I put these over And at this point, I will remember to set all of my layers to multiply. Multiply because, or darken, because they will more accurately reflect the way that ink is going to lay down on the piece of fabric. Here, a little less obvious, a little more subtle, but we can see these two vertical lines here, um, which in this particular pattern distract us from the organics that are otherwise in the imagery. So yeah, for the rest of the tutorial, I'm going to go through two parts. Part one, talking through how to create an organic jogline, and part two, how to use masking and adding of some more elements to give ourselves a little more wiggle room, a little more tolerance of mistakes in the printing registration process. And without further ado, I'm going to start. So I have these layers as individual smart objects. All you really need is just the composition of the single tile that you know works. I know that these work because I just demonstrated it here. So I'm going to select, I have the auto select on. I'm just going to select these layers that were my demonstrations of that to delete them. And then I'm going to dive into my smart composition. So wherever you start, you should start here where you have a tile in a single composition that you know works. I've already gone ahead and dragged in two guides. To either edge of the composition, and I know my canvas size, which is 6 by 8. And actually, my first step is going to be to buy myself a little bit of space on either side. We can adjust this later, so I'm just going to start off with adding a 1/2 inch to either side. And this is where my guides come in handy because I can see where the pattern like repeats right now at the moment. Okay, so the first step is going to be I'm going to make a copy of the layer. Now, all of my drawings and any like there's actually a lot of like schmutz in here, like in several groups. What's important is that it's just a single layer that you can deal with, or a single group layer. So I've made my copy by holding down Alt and holding and dragging the layer up. I'm going to delete that. So I have two copies. And now all I need to do is use the marquee tool, which I can press the L key to activate, Shift and L to cycle through the three options, but I'm going to use this one. You can use whichever one you want. And I'm just going to draw through my jogline. And the only thing to be sensitive of this question of where to draw it right now is like, well, there is a wider, like what's going to fit in your screen, because you'll see we'll wind up increasing the width of this pattern tile a little bit. But the only other question is like what's going to look good if we like overlap with the next tile a little too much, or we create too much of a gap. Like think about every element around this edge area being like shrunk or widened a little bit. So I'm gonna zoom in here and I'm gonna try to keep distinct like visual objects on one side of my line or the other. So I'm gonna dive down here. I'm going to try to replicate the texture or the like imagined edge of my objects a little bit by making this like grassy right here, but I can refine that later. And then I'm just going to try to keep the like positive area elements on one side or the other. So I'm going to keep these roots on one side. I'm going to go through here. I'm going to keep one rock on one side, another rock on the other. It is not as important with these rocks because I know that if I increase this white space or decrease it a little bit, it's not going to be that disruptive. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to make sure that I stay between the positive areas. Here, even though the rocks overlap, I'm going to treat them still as if there's like a gap in between them. And I'm going to go through this negative space here. And then I'm going to come finally to this black area. This is where I'm going to have to do some overlap work. So I'm just going to come straight through it. I'm going to come straight through this negative space as well. I am going to come a little bit over in this direction just because I think if this part of this curve gets wider or shorter, I'm going to be more okay than if I like break it up right here. But we'll see if that was a misjudgment or not. And then lastly, I'm just going to finish up the selection. If I had elements in my sky, I would also select them, but I don't. And so here is what I need for a layer mask. Okay, so the next thing after this step is I'm going to use this selection to create two masks for my layers. So I'll toggle the visibility of my original and I'll go to my copy and I will just press this mask button right here to create a mask, and we can see that it's masked out the elements to the right of that line that I drew, and then I will right click and on the mask and hit add mask to selection to bring that selection back, and then I'll toggle the visibility of that copy layer and go back to the original, and then I will hit the mask button again. My mistake. I will do Control Shift I. That inverts the mask, so it's the exact opposite, and then I will hit the mask button. And so now we have that organic line cutting this image on the other side. And if I toggle the visibility back on again of that top layer, we can see it has a complete image. There is a little artifacting in Photoshop here. I'm not going to worry too much about this because I know that for my purposes, when I print this with ink, it's going to bleed, and this like less than a single pixel of separation is just going to fill in. So that is no worries. Okay, great. Now, for demo purposes, I am going to add a solid color layer. I'm going to make it red, like in my opening examples. And I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click in between the layers to like isolate it to that layer. And then lastly, I'm going to change the blend mode to lighten, just so it only fills in the dark pixels. Great. I'm going to press the V key to pick up my black arrow tool again. And now I'm going to just demonstrate like the results of this because we're done with the jog line. So I'm going to take my selection of my copy layer and just drag it over. I might hold the Shift key down. Oh my God, Photoshop hates me. Oh, that's because I still have auto select on. I'm going to untoggle that. And I'm going to hold down the Shift key and drag this over so that it stays in the same horizontal vertical axis, but lets me move on the horizontal. And then I'm going to use the arrow keys to just nudge it into place. I know this is not quite right, but that's just how I design the pattern. Down here, the rocks do pick up at the right pixel spot. And I am good there. I'm going to untoggle this. I'm going to do Control semicolon to hide my guides. And the last thing I'm going to do is I see that my image is like going beyond my canvas side on the left side a little bit, so I'm just going to add another 1/4 inch to either side. And there, I'm done. I have a great jog line. Just to prove it, I will hold down Alt while I drag with the black arrow tool to make a copy of this other side of the thing, and I will nudge it back into place again, and there you can see in the ideal situation, this pattern still continues. And you know what? By making the jog line like this, if I nudge it like a little too far in like the overlap direction, and again, I'm going to make sure my layers are all multiplying, you can see that it's pretty forgiving. Like I can't even really tell where my cut was. I'll put it back there. I think that's right. So very, very useful to us in buying us some flexibility and like compressing things a little too much. Now, however, if I nudge it in the opposite direction, these dark areas of solid color still have a pretty obvious gap. And I mean in this grass area and this cloud area down here. So we're going to solve for that in part 2. Okay, so how do we deal with the potential for like too much gap to arise in the registration and printing process? I'm going to delete that copy I just made as an example. Make sure I delete it. I'm going to toggle back on this red screen layer just so I can see the two sections that I have. And I am going to put it back into place. I'm just going to do my best. There we go. Okay. And now I'm going to talk through two parts of this. One is drawing back in some of the mask to like just get some elements that we like. And then 2 is maybe adding some like rocks and like new rocks that will be there in all circumstances, but will kind of fill in this like dense rocky area should we have the gap. So I'll deal with the grass and the clouds because that's actually a slightly easier problem. I am going to start with the red layer because I think that'll be a little easier to illustrate. I'm going to hide the original, and then I'm going to right click on the mask again, and I'm going to go into the select and mask tool, which is very useful because it gives us the onion skin visibility into like what the hidden part of this layer looks like. And I'm going to use the brackets. I'm going to use the right bracket to increase the size of my brush here. And I am just going to paint in, by clicking, more of this. And I can hold down the Alt key to get the inverse of the brush. I'm going to make sure, oops, I'm going to make sure I have this full rock, but I'm not worried about the other rocks around it. I'm going to lower the size. I'm going to hold Alt to zoom in. I'm going to hold Alt to switch the brush. I'm just going to paint around, just try to give this a little bit more little overlap with the original layer, the black layer. And likewise over here, I'm gonna paint in like a lot more of this, but not too much. I'm gonna paint that in. I'm gonna hold down Alt. If I hold down Shift while still holding down Alt and then click over here, it'll cut like a straight line from the point I put down to the other point. So again, Alt, Shift, click, and then click again. It'll cut through. Likewise, without the Alt, it'll do the positive. Control Z there. Without the Alt, it'll do the positive. With the Alt, the negative. I'm gonna paint up. There we go. I'm gonna paint in this full stock and maybe hold down Alt right there. I just want a little bit more. Actually, I'm gonna paint in this blade of grass too. Maybe, no. I don't want like the exact same elements everywhere, especially where it's obvious if like the same thing appears side by side. So I'm actually going to try to invent my own grass here in a haphazard way. And then maybe I'll just go like this and like this. Okay, great. And then I'll hit OK to accept that changes to the mask. And then I'll toggle back on the original layer, and I will reduce the original layer's opacity again by pressing the 5 key to bring it to 50%. And there we can see some overlap. At this point, you might be wondering, okay, like, great, overlap. How much overlap? That's going to depend on your printing system and like how good your registration system is. And you'll need different tolerances, and that's only going to come with familiarity with how you're going to print. But if I was going to give a rule of thumb, I'd say 1/8 of an inch, and I can actually like use my guides to show that for me in Photoshop. So again, I'll do Control semicolon to toggle back in my guides. I have the ones from before. After expanding my canvas, I know like I did it like a 1/2 an inch and then 1/4 of an inch on each side. So now it's like 6 3/4. So I'm just going to keep that in mind. And then I know I want 1/8 of an inch minus or plus from 6 3/4 on that one side. So I'll go to View, Guides, New Guide. Photoshop lets you like type in the math. I'm just going to do 6.75, that's 6 3/4, minus 1 divided by 8. Who can remember what 1 divided by 8 is? And I'm going to do Guides, New Guide, again 6.75 plus 1 divided by 8. Great. So now I have that those guides there. And now if I select the copy layer, I can drag it over, like, you know, doesn't need to be perfect, but I can drag it over to 1/8 of an inch. And I can see what I'm missing. So I'm like it's down here. I'm actually going to fill in the black layer to like reach these gaps, these white spaces here where neither color is filling in. Um, but yeah, that's not yet done. And down here, looking pretty good. Yeah, looking just fine. These are clouds, they have bumps. And then I can see I kind of want some rocks here. And then I'll shift it over so there's too much overlap. This one's easier to assess if I toggle off the visibility and go back to my main layer and I press 0 to bring its transparency back up to 100. I'll take a look here. Um, it's a little awkward, but not different from some of the stuff I just like drew. Over here, the roots, again, a little tangled. I'm not too worried about it because it's not the focus of the design elements over here. So I'm fine. In fact, I like the way the rocks look. I like the way the smaller stones look. I'm not going to try to do too much more compensation for too much overlap. So I'm going to take that copy layer, I'm going to put it back at like our ideal position. And actually, I apologize. I'm going to take it over to our, like, let's say this is our theoretical, like, maximum gap position. And then I'm going to solve for some problems here now. I'll make it red again for demo purposes. So I'm going to go to the black layer. I'm going to right click on the mask. I'm going to do select and mask to bring up the black layer. I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to have my handy dandy paintbrush tool, and I'm just going to paint in a little bit more of my black grass that hangs out over here. And I'm going to use the Alt key again just to shave off just enough like that. And I'm chilling over here. And then I'm going to hit OK and accept that change. Okay, great. And lastly, I'm going to add in the rocks. And for the rocks, you could put them in your main layer. I'm just going to make a new layer by pressing the little plus new layer button. I'm going to select my pencil tool with B. You might automatically wind up in the brush, and you can cycle through by doing Shift B. I'm going to cycle to the pencil just so I don't have any, my design isn't perfect. There's a little bit of opacity around some of my edges, but that's not going to print on a piece of acetate or paper very well. So it's better to work as opaquely as possible. And so with the pencil tool selected and my color is black, I'm just going to add in some elements that I don't mind getting overlapped later, because I have to remember that my ideal position is right here. And in fact, I'm going to leave it here at the ideal position and then go back to my new drawing layer just to like make sure I'm painting like in places where I kind of want things to be more or less. So, I might put a differently shaped rock here. The reason I'm not like just adding these rocks in again is because should they be like separated from each other, I don't want them to be like so obviously like the same rock like repeated next to each other. So I'm just gonna put like, yeah, like, I don't know, polka dots. I'm forgetting exactly where my gap is, so I'm gonna put this back, more or less here. It doesn't actually matter because I can't actually predict like how much of a mistake I'm gonna make. Nah, actually, maybe some smaller rocks here. No, I'm gonna put something like right there so that if it winds up overlapping with this one, it doesn't look super weird. And I see a little rock here, so I'll put, in fact, a little rock here. And then maybe just a little something here, like that. We'll smooth that out. Smooth that out. I could do that in my masking too, but I'm just gonna let it be. All right, and then I'm going to take a look. I'm going to hide that. I'm going to say hide my guides with control semicolon. I'm going to say that's okay. I'm going to show the red layer again. I'm going to bring back my guides. I'm going to put things back into their ideal position. Eek. Let me try to get that. There we go. I'll put the red layer away. I'll hide things. I'll say, hey, I can't even tell that I added new elements. Um, we're set. I'm gonna just put the red layer back on for one more second so I can show y'all that I'm dragging it over. And I'm gonna nudge it into place with the arrow tool, arrow key. And then I'll turn off my red layer and I will hit Control S to save. And that's it. That is a tile with some tolerance for too much overlap or too much gap and a organic jog line. Okay, so lastly, I'm just gonna demonstrate like how this is working. So I'm back here on my like parent composition, and what I want to do is just illustrate like how useful what we just did is. So I have my shrub layer, kind of this plant layer. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and drag over copy. I'm gonna note that it is darken blend mode. And I'm just going to drag it into place into the ideal position. I already have that red layer still, so I'm going to activate it. I'm going to hold down Alt in between the layers to isolate it to that layer. I'm going to select the original layer. I'm going to press 5 to lower the opacity again. And I'm just going to pay attention to the overlap. Okay, great. And I'm going to drag in some new guides. I'm going to make sure, do I have any guides visible? I do. Okay, so I'm going to drag in a new guide. I'm going to put it here, and I'm just going to eyeball like that 1/8 of an inch hash mark. So what is this? All the way from 4 to 5, so that's like, oh my god, I don't even know. Hold on. Let's zoom out again. Okay, so that's about like a 1/2 inch, so that's a quarter. So let's say, this would be a quarter, this would be an 1/8. So we'll put an 1/8 here, and we'll put an 1/8 like here. And I'll just take the red layer and I'll drag it away, and then I'll toggle off the red and I'll bring back up the opacity of the other one, and I'll hide my guides and I'll take a look and I'll say, all right, the only thing I might do is go back here and add a little more black, but besides that, it's looking pretty good. I'll turn those things back on, and then I will slide my red layer over once again, this time for too much overlap. And then I'll turn things off last time, and I'll take another look, and it's definitely like a little compressed, but that is not that bad. So that's the conclusion of the tutorial. There you go.